Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in the northwestern parts of the Sochi direction. The Russians also managed to advance within Vovchansk in the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region. The Russians managed to advance further beyond the capture of the town at the border between Russia and Kharkiv. The Russians also managed to advance south of flank of Chasiv Yar, as well as west of Andreevka, west of Kharkiv, and further along the fortified positions northwest of Velika Novosilka, where if we take a closer look, we can see that there is a complete collapse of the fortified positions here, where the Russians have almost full control of the entire first and second line of defense, with just a few fortified positions that are outside the connection between these fortified positions. The Russians have captured the second line of defense except for a single fortified position, and the Russians have captured the first line of defense in its entirety except for a few fortified positions to the north near Donetsk and Previlne. The Russian capture of these fortified positions signifies how weak the Ukrainian defenses have become here northwest of Velika Novosilka. The Ukrainians dedicated a lot of manpower and resources for the defense of the town, and with the encirclement of much of this, the Russians managed to significantly weaken the Ukrainian defense to the northwest of the town. Now that the Russians have captured these fortified positions, the towns surrounding the area, Berlatske, Skutne, Vilnopole, and Shevchenko, are all in danger for the Russian operations in the future. Russians will be able to capture these with little resistance all the way up to Shevchenko, from which the Russians will start the battle over the final line of defense here in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. The Russians will likely look to bypass this from the eastern direction to flank the fortified positions and ignore them completely by advancing along the main highway. In connection to this, we see that the Russians have managed to capture the final remaining fortified positions here west of Andreevka. With this, the Russians can now start the Battle of Oleksivka further west of the fortified positions and the towns here along the Vovcha river line. And with the fighting continuing in Constantinople, the Russians are slowly developing their offensive operations towards Bahatir as well. The Russians will look to gain control of Constantinople, then move on to capture Oleksivka and Bahatir. The Russians will look to capture Ruslev by bypassing it from the north, and with their proximity to the town from the south, the Ukrainian forces there would be encircled, and with the capture of Bahatir, Ruslev will itself also fall. The Russians will then move further west along the main highway towards Komar and Perebudova, where they'll look to gain control over the eastern bank of the river line. The Russians will also likely advance alongside the river line towards Vesele. In conclusion, with the capture of the fortified positions and the fortified positions near Andreevka, the Russians have significantly improved their positions here in this section of the front line, and it's only a matter of time before the Russians gain control over the remaining parts of the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. Further offensive operations are also taking place in between Andreevka and Pokrovsk. However, there's been no developments in this 24-hour time frame. In the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have managed to advance in the southern flank of it towards Tupushki, where the Russians are now on the outskirts of the town from the eastern and southeastern directions. The Russians are here looking to attack it from both of these directions, from the northern and southern flanks. But they're facing a lot of resistance from the Ukrainian fortified positions. To capture Tupushki, the Russians don't not just need to walk into the town. They need to take a look at the fortified positions behind Tupushki, which is also located at the high ground area near Chasiv Yar. And with the advantages of these fortified positions, it's difficult for the Russians to advance directly head on. And with the close proximity to Konstantinivka, the Ukrainians can make use of these fortified positions as a buffer zone between them and the Russian positions. And with intense FPV coverage by the large concentration of forces that can be centered within Konstantinivka, the Russians would be attacked by FPV drones no matter where they attack from this direction. And this is why the Russians will be looking to not storm the town directly, or the city in this case, but to attack it from multiple directions, following the capture of Donetsk in the southeast. And with the fighting ongoing over Chasiv Yar, the Russians would align the front line to the east and to the southeast. The Russians would need to close the pocket south of Konstantinivka, by the encirclement maneuver that they are currently conducting from the Kursk direction and from the intersection area here east of Pokrovsk, following which you'll also have a front line to the south, and with the capture of the fortified positions alongside the main highway, they will also be able to cut it off from the west, and this will be a semi-encirclement of the city for the Russian forces to heavily bombard the city and through a battle of attrition take control of it, similar to the city of Bakhmut and what is happening near Pokrovsk as well. The question here is, do the Ukrainians have enough forces to defend the city? Do they have the necessary manpower and equipment to do so? That is what determines how long this battle will be. At the same time, if the Russians also expanded to the other cities as Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Khrushchevka, and Pokrovsk at the same time, it will be limited how many soldiers they can dedicate to each of these positions, and the Russians who are on the offensive will have the initiative in terms of where the majority of forces will be allocated. If the Russians concentrate all of their forces in the direction of Pokrovsk, it will be difficult for the Ukrainians to ignore that, and they would have to send their own forces in that direction. And if the Russians simply outnumber the Ukrainians too much, they can concentrate a lot of forces in all of these directions, and they'll be able to outman and outgun the Ukrainian forces. And that is the danger that the Ukrainians are facing, mathematically speaking. If they continue the defense of these cities, even if they have a lot of FPV drone operators, they'll not be able to defend them unless they have the necessary firepower and manpower to do so. And once the Russians enter a city and dig in, the effectiveness of the FPV drones are significantly limited, and this will give the Russians a significant advantage when it comes to the battle, because what is allowing the Ukrainians to keep up with the Russian forces is the effectiveness of the FPV drones. But once urban warfare starts, the Russians can hide inside the buildings, and therefore the FPV drones will be significantly less effective. And with the higher firepower weapons such as FAB bombs and artillery being much more in favor of the Russians, the urban warfare is much more favorable for the Russians, and therefore once the Russians enter the cities such as Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, they'll be able to capture them much quicker than it takes for them to actually enter the city themselves. And this is why the Ukrainians are focusing so much on preventing an entry of Russian forces into these cities. That is to prevent them from making use of this advantage that they will be able to gain. We saw a similar case in the direction of Kharkiv. Once the Russians entered the town, they managed to capture it fairly quickly, while entering the town itself took much more time. Moving on to the Kharkiv section of the front line, we see that the Russians managed to advance north of the town of Topoli following the capture of it. They're moving through and clearing the forest lines and forest patches in the area to allow for a wider crossing available for the Russian forces and to connect multiple roads with each other towards Stroivka and Polohivka here further north, and that is to expand the front line here near the Usk River line. With control over the region to the south, will be able to connect their forces from the north and the south to capture Kamyanka and allow for another crossing across the Usk River line, and then they can move on to capture some more of these towns alongside the river line, expanding it further westwards. So you see that the Russians continued offensive operations along the Usk River line to expand their bridgehead further and to connect with the Russian border area. The Russians also managed to advance further within Vovchansk. This is the fourth advance within the town this month, and we see that the Russians have continued offensive operations here in the Vovchansk direction, following the Ukrainians' concentration of forces in other sectors of the front line other than the Kharkiv one, and this means that the Ukrainians are prioritizing other sectors over the Vovchansk direction. If the Russians capture Vovchansk in its entirety, not just the northern bank of it, they could start offensive operations to connect the Usk River line with the border area near the city of Belgorod, and this would significantly improve the supply capabilities of the Russian forces in the area and allow for further offensive operations along the Seversky Donetsk river line and cut off the connection of Izium from the city of Kharkiv. In the Kursk direction, we see here that the Russians have advanced further northeast of Svetlikovo, capturing half of Lebedivka, leaving the town cut in two along the main road going through the center of it. So with this, we see that the Russians continued offensive operations to gain control over the Luknia river line, as they have entered the Ukrainian side of the border into the Sumy region to start the battle over Vasivka and along the Lugny River line here. And they also continue in the northeastern direction to gain control of Lebedivka. We see that the Russians' objective here is to gain control over the Lugny River line and to cut off the main supply route going in and out of the Kursk region for the Ukrainians. All across the front line, we see that the Russians continue their offensive operations, and in conclusion, we see that the Russians continue to advance. The Ukrainians are struggling to keep up with their defenses to deal with the Russian forces, and the battle of attrition continues here on the third year of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.